The Iron Crown of the Franks. The air in St. Peter's Basilica on that Christmas day in the year 800 was thick with incense and the fervent murmur of prayer. It was cold in Rome, a damp chill that seeped through the stone walls, but inside, the heat of 1,000 bodies and the glow of countless candles created an island of warmth in the heart of a fractured world. At the altar stood a giant of a man, kneeling in uncharacteristic humility. He was Karl, king of the Franks and Lombards, Patricius Romanorum, the protector of the Romans. A man of war, of law, of deep, pragmatic faith. He wore a simple tunic and cloak, as was his custom, but his bearing spoke of a lifetime of authority. As he rose from prayer, something unprecedented happened. Pope Leo III, a man whose position Karl had restored after a brutal rebellion in Rome had left him mutilated and desperate, stepped forward. In his hands was a circlet of gold and jewels. Before the astonished eyes of the congregation, the Roman nobility, and Karl's own Frankish retinue, the Pope placed the crown upon the king's head. A great roar filled the basilica, echoing off the mosaicked vaults, to Karl, Augustus, crowned by God, the great and peace-bringing emperor of the Romans, life and victory. The title was a thunderclap, an event that would resonate for 1,000 years. But as the acclamations washed over him, the chroniclers noted a curious detail. The newly crowned emperor was not smiling. His face, usually so expressive, was a mask of stern deliberation. He would later claim that had he known the Pope's intention, he would never have entered the church that day, despite the great feast of Christ's nativity. Why this reluctance? The man history would call Charlemagne, Charles the Great, was no stranger to power. He was the master of Western Europe, his domain stretching from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, from the North Sea to central Italy. Yet this crown was different. It was not the iron helm of a Frankish warlord, but the golden diadem of a dead empire. It was a title from Constantinople, from the still-living Roman emperor in the East, who would view this act as a brazen usurpation. More importantly, it was a title bestowed by a pope, binding his dynasty and his kingdom to the Bishop of Rome in a way that was both powerful and perilous. This moment was not a beginning, but a culmination. It was the climax of a lifetime spent forging an empire with the sword, and the start of a new, uncertain chapter, the story of the Holy Roman Empire. The Forge of a King, 768 to 774 AD. The world Charlemagne was born into in 742 was one of chaos and opportunity. The great Roman order had long since crumbled, its roads decaying, its cities shrinking, its legions a distant memory. In its place, a patchwork of Germanic kingdoms rose and fell. The Merovingian dynasty, the supposed long-haired kings of the Franks, had become little more than figureheads, their power hollowed out by the men who truly ruled, the mayors of the palace. One such mayor was Charles Martel, the Hammer, who had famously turned back the Muslim Umayyad advance into Gaul at the Battle of Tours in 732. His son, Pepin the Short, possessed a king's ambition to match his kingly power. In 751, he made his move. He sent messengers to Pope Zachary in Rome with a pointed question: who should be king, the one who has the power, or the one who has only the title? The Pope, needing a powerful ally against the Lombards of Italy, gave the answer Pepin desired: it is better to call king the one who has the power rather than the one who is without it. Thus, the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, was tonsured and packed off to a monastery, and Pepin was anointed king of the Franks by the hand of Saint Boniface. This was a revolutionary act. It was not a bloodright claimed from some pagan past, but a sacred authority granted by God through his church. The papacy had made a king, and in return, it expected a protector. Pepin's son, Karl, was raised in this new world of sacred kingship and relentless expansion. He was a child of the frontier, schooled in war, hunting, and the rudiments of Christian theology. When Pepin died in 768, the Frankish kingdom was divided, as was tradition, between his two sons, Karl and his younger brother, Charlemagne. The division was uneasy from the start. The brothers were not close, and their courts became rival centers of power. For 3 years, a civil war seemed inevitable, a prospect that the Frankish nobility, the Aquitanians, and the Lombards across the Alps watched with keen interest. But fate intervened. In 771, Charlemagne died suddenly. His widow, with her young sons, fled to the court of Desiderius, the Lombard king, fearing the ambitions of her brother-in-law. Karl did not hesitate. He repudiated his own Lombard wife, Desiderius's daughter, and moved swiftly to seize his brother's territories. The Frankish nobility, seeing the direction of the wind, flocked to his banner. In one bold stroke, the Frankish kingdom was reunited under a single, formidable ruler. His first great test came from Italy. Desiderius, harboring Carloman's family and thus a potential rival claimant, had begun to threaten the Papal States. The new pope, Adrian I, a man of iron will, appealed to the Frankish king, reminding him of the alliance his father had sworn. For Karl, this was both a duty and an opportunity. The Lombards controlled the rich Po Valley and threatened the Alpine passes. They were a barrier to complete Frankish dominance. In the autumn of 773, Karl led his army, a vast host of Frankish veterans, Burgundian levies, and savage Austrasian frontier fighters, across the Alps. It was a feat of immense logistical daring. The Lombards had fortified the high passes, but a Frankish detachment found a secret path through the mountains, outflanking the defenders and throwing them into a panic. The Lombard army retreated to their capital, Pavia. Karl laid siege to the city, a siege that would last through the winter and into the following spring. While his army camped in the marshes around Pavia, Karl performed an act of profound symbolic importance. He traveled to Rome. His entry into the Eternal City in the spring of 774 was not that of a conqueror, but of a pious pilgrim. He walked the sacred steps on his knees, prayed at the tombs of the apostles, and was received with imperial pomp by Pope Adrian. In a series of meetings, they reaffirmed the pact between the Franks and the papacy. Karl confirmed his father's donations of land, the donation of Pepin, which granted the Pope temporal rule over a swath of central Italy, the birth of the Papal States. In return, he received the Pope's unwavering spiritual and political support. When he returned to Pavia, the city was on the verge of collapse. Desiderius surrendered, and Karl entered the city as its master. He took for himself the iron crown of the Lombards, a narrow band of metal said to be forged from a nail of the true cross. He was now Rex Francorum et Langobardorum, king of the Franks and the Lombards. The most powerful kingdom in the West now had a foothold in the heart of the old Roman world. The stage was being set. The Saxon War, 772 to 804 AD. If Italy was a prize, Saxony was a curse. To the northeast of the Frankish heartlands, beyond the Rhine, lay a vast, untamed land of dark forests and misty moors. This was the home of the Saxon tribes, a pagan people who worshipped the old gods, Woden, Thunor, Saxnot. They were a hardy, freedom-loving people, organized in loose clans, with no cities and no king. Their way of life was built on raiding, and for generations, they had been a thorn in the side of the Franks, launching lightning raids across the river to plunder, burn, and enslave. For Karl, the Saxons were more than a nuisance, they were an existential threat to his vision of a Christian kingdom. Their land bordered his, and their paganism was an affront to the God he served with such militant zeal. The conquest and conversion of Saxony became the great project of his reign, a brutal, 30-year war of attrition that would test the limits of Frankish power and stain his legacy with blood. The war began in 772 with a symbolic act of supreme provocation. At a key Frankish stronghold, Karl summoned a diet of his nobles and announced his intention to march into Saxony. His first target was the Irminsul, a great pillar that the Saxons believed held up the universe, a sacred site where they made sacrifices and stored vast treasures. The Frankish army found the Irminsul near Paderborn, a colossal tree trunk venerated as the axis of the world. Karl ordered it felled. His soldiers, seeing this as a spiritual battle, hacked the sacred pillar to pieces, looted the gold and silver offerings, and massacred the Saxon priests who tried to defend it. It was a declaration of total war, not just for land, but for souls. The Saxon response was swift and furious. Led by a charismatic noble named Witikind, they launched a series of devastating counter-raids. They would swear oaths of loyalty to Karl when his army was present, only to revolt the moment his back was turned. The war became a cycle of Frankish punitive expeditions, forced baptisms, and the building of fortresses, followed by Saxon rebellions, the massacre of Frankish garrisons and Christian missionaries, and the burning of churches. The nadir came in 782. Karl believed he had pacified the region. He had established a network of counties and bishoprics, and a large body of Saxon nobles had sworn fealty and accepted baptism. He had even left a powerful army in the area under the command of trusted counts. But Witikind, who had been hiding in Denmark, returned and stirred up a massive revolt. The Frankish army, confident and seeking a decisive battle, marched to meet the Saxon host at the Suntal Mountains. They were overconfident and failed to properly scout the terrain. The Saxons, masters of the land, ambushed them in a narrow pass. In the ensuing massacre, known as the Battle of the Suntal, 4 of Karl's most important commanders, 20 lesser nobles, and thousands of Frankish soldiers were slaughtered. It was the worst military defeat of Charlemagne's life. His response was swift and merciless. He assembled a new army and marched directly to the source of the rebellion near Verdun, on the banks of the Aller River. There, he confronted the Saxon leaders who had surrendered. He demanded they hand over those responsible for the rebellion and the breaking of their oaths. When the Saxons hesitated, Karl passed a judgment of biblical ferocity. He ordered the execution of 4,500 Saxon prisoners. The massacre of Verdun sent a shockwave through Europe. Even in an age of routine violence, the scale and cold efficiency of the slaughter were terrifying. It was a calculated act of terror, designed to break the Saxon will forever. For a time, it worked. Witikind, seeing the futility of further resistance, and perhaps fearing a similar fate, finally surrendered. In 785, he came to Karl's palace at Attigny and submitted to baptism, with Charlemagne himself standing as his godfather. It was a masterstroke of political theater. The great pagan champion was now a Christian, integrated into the Frankish fold. But the war was not over. Sporadic revolts continued for another 2 decades. Karl's strategy evolved. He began a policy of mass deportation, moving thousands of Saxons to Frankish lands and settling Franks in Saxony to break tribal cohesion. He issued the harsh Capitulatio de Partibus Saxoniae, a legal code that imposed the death penalty for a range of pagan practices, from cremating the dead to eating meat during Lent. It was a brutal program of cultural genocide. Finally, by 804, the resistance was crushed. Saxony was carved into Frankish counties, dotted with monasteries and churches. The frontier was pushed to the Elbe River. The cost had been immense in blood and treasure, but Charlemagne had achieved his goal. He had added a vast new territory to his realm and, in his mind, had brought countless souls to Christ. The warrior king had proven himself a relentless, and at times ruthless, instrument of God's will. The imperial coronation, 799 to 800 AD. The Saxon War had cemented Charlemagne's reputation as the dominant power in the West. But it was chaos in Rome that provided the final catalyst for the revival of the imperial title. In April 799, Pope Leo III was set upon in the streets of Rome during a religious procession. A faction of Roman nobles, led by the late Pope Adrian's nephews, ambushed him. They attempted to gouge out his eyes and cut out his tongue, a traditional method for rendering a claimant to high office unfit, and left him for dead in the street. Miraculously, Leo survived, his sight and speech reportedly restored by divine intervention. He fled across the Alps to seek the protection of the king of the Franks, who was at his campaign court in Paderborn, still overseeing the final stages of the Saxon submission. The meeting at Paderborn was charged with significance. A pope, the successor of St. Peter, was now a supplicant at the court of a Frankish king. Karl received him with all the honor due his office, but he was in a position of immense power. He provided Leo with an armed escort and promised to come to Rome to restore order and judge the Pope's accusers. For a year, Karl prepared. He consolidated affairs in his kingdom and consulted his theologians, particularly the brilliant Anglo-Saxon monk, Alcuin of York. The question being debated in court circles was profound. With a woman, Irene, sitting on the imperial throne in Constantinople, an act many in the West viewed as monstrous, was the office of Emperor of the Romans actually vacant? Did authority in Christendom now devolve to the most powerful and pious Christian ruler? Alcuin, in his letters, began to refer to Charlemagne's domain not just as the Regnum Francorum, Kingdom of the Franks, but as the Imperium Christianum, Christian Empire. The ideological groundwork was being laid. In November 800, Charlemagne crossed the Alps into Italy for the last time. He entered Rome a week before Christmas at the head of a powerful army. He summoned a council of Frankish and Roman clergy and nobles to investigate the charges against Leo III. The Pope, in a dramatic move, swore an oath of purgation on the Gospels, declaring his innocence before God and man. His accusers were arrested and sentenced to death, though Karl, in a show of mercy, commuted their sentence to exile. With order restored, the stage was set for Christmas Day. Karl went to St. Peter's Basilica to celebrate the Mass. As he rose from prayer before the tomb of the Apostle, Pope Leo III stepped forward and placed the imperial crown upon his head. The title was Emperor of the Romans. It was a deliberate evocation of the past, a direct challenge to Constantinople, and a statement that the center of gravity of the Christian world had shifted from the Bosphorus to the Rhine. The act was, in theory, a restoration. But it was a restoration with a profound difference. The Roman Empire was now inextricably fused with the Frankish monarchy and the Latin Church. It was, in essence, a new creation, a Holy Roman Empire. Charlemagne's reported displeasure is telling. He was a master of practical politics. He understood that by being crowned by the Pope, he had, in the eyes of many, placed his imperial authority in a position of dependency on the papacy. He had gained a glittering title, but he had also accepted a potential chain. The delicate balance of power between emperor and pope, a dynamic that would define medieval politics for centuries, was born in that moment of triumph and tension. The Carolingian Renaissance. An empire needs more than just armies and laws, it needs an idea. Charlemagne, though barely literate himself, understood this better than any of his contemporaries. The sprawling patchwork of territories he ruled was a babel of different languages, legal traditions, and cultural levels. His own court and administration were staffed by Franks, Lombards, Goths, and Saxons. To bind this diverse realm together, he initiated a cultural and intellectual revival that historians would later call the Carolingian Renaissance. His primary instrument was the Church. He saw the clergy not only as spiritual guides but as the administrative backbone of his empire. But the Church in his domains was in a sorry state. Many priests were illiterate, unable to read the Vulgate Bible or perform the liturgy correctly. Monasteries, the repositories of classical learning, had seen their standards slip. Local liturgical practices had diverged into a confusing patchwork, and the Latin of the Mass was often corrupted by local dialects. Charlemagne's remedy was to summon the finest minds of Europe to his court. From Italy came the grammarian Peter of Pisa and the historian Paul the Deacon. From Spain came Theodulf of Orleans, a brilliant poet and theologian. And most importantly, from the intellectual powerhouse of Anglo-Saxon England, he summoned Alcuin of York. Alcuin became the mastermind of the Renaissance. He took charge of the palace school at Aachen, where he educated not only the young princes and nobles but the emperor himself. Charlemagne, in his 40s and 50s, would have tablets and writing materials placed under his pillow, painstakingly practicing his letters late into the night. He never fully mastered the art, but his passion for learning was genuine and infectious. Under Alcuin's direction, a massive project of copying and correction began. Scribes and monastic scriptoria across the empire were set to work, transcribing not only the Bible and liturgical books but also the surviving works of classical Latin authors, Virgil, Cicero, Livy, and Boethius. They developed a new, clear, and uniform script known as Carolingian minuscule, which dramatically improved legibility. This script would become the foundation for our modern lowercase letters. Charlemagne issued a series of decrees, or capitularies, aimed at standardizing and elevating religious and intellectual life. The Admonitio Generalis of 789 ordered the establishment of schools for boys in every monastery and bishopric, and mandated the correct performance of the liturgy. He pushed for a uniform text of the Bible, a project personally overseen by Alcuin. This was not a renaissance of new ideas in the modern sense. It was a conservative movement, a desperate and successful salvage operation. Its goal was to preserve and standardize the knowledge of the past, both Christian and classical, and to use that unified culture as the glue for his empire. The palaces and churches built during his reign, most notably his magnificent Palatine Chapel in Aachen, were physical manifestations of this new imperial culture, blending Roman, Byzantine, and Frankish architectural elements into a powerful, unified statement. The man at the center of this whirlwind of activity was a fascinating paradox. Charlemagne the warrior, who could order the massacre of thousands, was also Charlemagne the lawgiver, patiently listening to the disputes of his subjects. He was the barbarian king who wore Frankish trousers and fur cloaks, yet he built a capital at Aachen in conscious imitation of Roman and Byzantine emperors, complete with thermal baths. He was the devoted Christian who had 4 wives and several concubines, fathering numerous children. He was a man of immense physical energy, a great hunter and swimmer, who loved the old Germanic epic poetry even as he promoted the staid Latin of the Church. He was, in short, the perfect embodiment of the empire he created, a fusion of the classical, the Christian, and the Germanic, forged into something new and powerful. The shadow of the throne, 806 to 814 AD. As the 9th century dawned, Charlemagne's empire was at its zenith. He had secured his borders through relentless campaigning, pushing the frontier with the Muslim Umayyads in Spain to the Ebro River, a campaign that would later be romanticized in the Song of Roland, and containing the Slavic and Avar threats to the east. In 812, after a series of conflicts and negotiations, the Byzantine Emperor Michael I Rangabe finally sent envoys to Aachen who addressed Charlemagne as Basilius, Emperor, a grudging but crucial recognition of his imperial title. Yet, the very scale of his achievement posed its own problem, succession. The Frankish tradition was to divide the kingdom among all legitimate sons. Charlemagne himself had begun his rule-sharing power with his brother. He was determined to avoid a similar fragmentation of his life's work. In 806, he gathered his nobles at Thionville and issued the Divisio Regnorum, a blueprint for the partition of the empire after his death. The plan divided his lands among his 3 adult sons, Charles the Younger, Pepin of Italy, and Louis the Pious. The title of emperor was not mentioned. It seemed the imperial dignity was to die with him, a personal accolade rather than an inheritable office. But fate, once again, intervened. In 810, Pepin of Italy died. The following year, in 811, his eldest and favorite son, Charles the Younger, also died. Suddenly, the only surviving legitimate son was Louis, the king of Aquitaine, a man of deep piety but questionable political and military grit. In 813, a weary and grieving Charlemagne summoned Louis to Aachen. The old emperor, now in his early 70s, his body racked with gout and fever, knew his time was short. He assembled the great magnates of the empire in his magnificent chapel. There, without the presence or sanction of the Pope, he personally crowned Louis as co-emperor and his successor. He then ordered his son to take the crown from the altar and place it upon his own head, a powerful symbol of an authority that came directly from God, not through the mediation of the Bishop of Rome. It was his last great act of state. Through the winter, his health declined. In January 814, he developed a severe fever. On the morning of January 28, after receiving communion, the Emperor Charlemagne died. He was 72 years old. He was buried the same day in the Palatine Chapel at Aachen, seated upright on a throne, clothed in his imperial robes, with a gospel book open on his lap. The idea endures. The empire did not long survive its founder. Louis the Pious, though well-intentioned, lacked his father's iron will and military prowess. He was unable to control the ambitions of his own sons, and after his death, the empire was partitioned by the Treaty of Verdun, 843, into 3 parts, which would form the rough outlines of modern France, Germany, and the territory in between. The title of emperor fell into abeyance, then was revived in the 10th century by the German king Otto I, who cemented the empire's character as a primarily German entity. The Holy Roman Empire of the German nation would persist, in one form or another, for 1,000 years, until it was dissolved by Napoleon in 1806. Yet, the legacy of Charlemagne and that Christmas day in 800 was far greater than the political entity he founded. He had created a new model of kingship, fused with Christian mission and Roman tradition. He had preserved the core of classical learning through his Renaissance, providing the foundation for the intellectual life of the High Middle Ages. He had established the template for the close, often fraught, relationship between church and state that would define medieval Europe. More than any single man since the fall of Rome, Charlemagne had given a fractured West a sense of unity, of common purpose, and of a shared identity as Christendom. His empire was a fleeting political reality, but the idea he forged, of a unified, Christian civilization under a single, God-ordained temporal leader, would echo through the centuries, inspiring popes and emperors, kings and crusaders, long after his bones had turned to dust in his tomb at Aachen. He was the father of Europe, and the story of the Holy Roman Empire is, in its first and most brilliant chapter, the story of his colossal life. The Weight of the Crown, 814 to 840 AD. Louis the Pious, who had spent most of his life as a dutiful sub-king in Aquitaine, arrived in Aachen to find an empire that was a monument to his father's will. The court, once vibrant with the clamor of warriors, scholars, and diplomats from every corner of Europe, had grown somber. Charlemagne's presence had been the sun around which the political planets orbited. Without it, the delicate balance of power began to wobble. Louis, a man whose piety was his defining characteristic, saw his inheritance not as a prize to be enjoyed, but as a burden to be borne for the salvation of his soul and his people. His first act was a purge. He expelled from Aachen his father's numerous illegitimate daughters, whose lively and politically entangled presence he deemed a source of scandal. He dismissed many of the old guard, courtiers he viewed as licentious or corrupt, replacing them with his own Aquitanian advisors and, most significantly, a circle of rigorous monastic reformers led by Benedict of Anian. The goal was to transform the Frankish court from a warrior's hall into a monastery for a king. This reformation of the palace alienated the powerful Frankish aristocracy, men whose loyalty had been bought with plunder, land, and a place at Charlemagne's feasting table. They saw Louis not as a mighty warrior king in his father's image, but as a monkish ruler controlled by clerics. To consolidate his authority and ensure a peaceful succession, Louis took a momentous step in 817. He issued the Ordinatio Imperii, a new law of the empire. Breaking from Frankish tradition, it declared the empire to be indivisible. His eldest son, Lothair, was crowned co-emperor and designated as the sole heir. His younger sons, Pepin and Louis, later called the German, were given subordinate roles as kings of Aquitaine and Bavaria, but were explicitly forbidden from aspiring to the imperial title. The Ordinatio was a revolutionary document, born of Louis's desire for unity and peace. It was also a catastrophic political miscalculation. It treated the empire as a single, sacred entity, ignoring the deep-seated regional loyalties and the Frankish expectation that all royal sons receive a share of their father's patrimony. It sowed the seeds of bitter resentment. The first crack appeared with the death of Louis's first wife. When he remarried a beautiful and ambitious young woman named Judith, and she bore him a new son in 823, the carefully laid plans of the Ordinatio shattered. Judith, fiercely protective of her son Charles's future, demanded a kingdom for him, just as his half-brothers had. Louis, enamored of his new wife and son, agreed. He began carving out territories from the inheritances of Lothair, Pepin, and Louis the German to create a new kingdom for the boy, who would be known to history as Charles the Bald. This provoked immediate and violent rebellion. The older sons, feeling their rights had been violated, rose against their father. The empire was plunged into a series of civil wars that would consume the rest of Louis's reign. The spectacle was shocking. An emperor, anointed by God, was repeatedly humiliated by his own sons. In 833, at the Field of Lies, Louis's army deserted him, and he was forced to surrender to Lothair. He was deposed in a grotesque ceremony where he was made to confess to a litany of invented crimes and publicly stripped of his imperial regalia. Though Louis was later restored to power, the damage was irreversible. The aura of inviolable, God-given authority that Charlemagne had so carefully cultivated was broken. The empire was now a prize to be fought over, its unity secondary to the ambitions of its ruling family. When Louis the Pious finally died in 840, on an island in the Rhine, exhausted by war and betrayal, he left behind not a unified empire, but a fratricidal conflict that would determine its fate. The Partitions of an Idea, 840 to 870 AD. The death of Louis the Pious was the starting pistol for a final, brutal war of succession. On one side stood Lothair, the senior emperor, insisting on the terms of the Ordinatio Imperii. Arrayed against him were his two younger brothers, Louis the German, who held the eastern Frankish lands, and Charles the Bald, who had consolidated power in the west. They formed an alliance against what they saw as Lothair's overreach. The decisive clash came at the Battle of Fontenoy in 841. It was a bloodbath of unprecedented scale between Frankish armies, a slaughter of the flower of Frankish nobility that horrified contemporaries. Lothair was defeated, but the war ground on, a destructive stalemate that laid waste to the very heartlands of the Carolingian world. Exhaustion finally forced a settlement. In 843, the three brothers met in the city of Verdun. Their task was to dismantle their grandfather's masterpiece. The Treaty of Verdun divided the Carolingian Empire into three distinct kingdoms. Lothair received the central portion, a long, unwieldy strip of territory stretching from the North Sea down through the Low Countries, Burgundy, Provence, and Italy. He also retained the hollowed-out title of emperor. Louis the German received the largely Germanic-speaking lands east of the Rhine, the Regnum Teutonicorum, the Kingdom of Germany. Charles the Bald received the western, predominantly Romance-speaking territories of West Francia, which would become the kernel of the Kingdom of France. The partition of Verdun was a geopolitical event of world historical importance. It created the rough outlines of modern Western Europe. More immediately, it shattered the Carolingian ideal of a unified Imperium Christianum. The empire was now a tripartite reality, and the imperial title, held by the ruler of the fragile Middle Kingdom, was stripped of much of its universal authority. The Middle Kingdom, lacking any ethnic or linguistic cohesion, proved unsustainable. When Lothair's son died without a strong heir, his uncles, Charles the Bald and Louis the German, pounced. In 870, by the Treaty of Meissen, they carved up the northern part of the Middle Kingdom between them, further consolidating the East and West Frankish realms and leaving only a rump, Kingdom of Italy, tenuously linked to the imperial title. The Carolingian dynasty continued, but its light was fading. The 9th century also brought a new terror from the outside world, the Vikings. Their swift longships, navigating the rivers of Francia, struck deep into the heart of the empire, sacking cities like Paris, Rouen, and Aachen itself. The Carolingian kings, preoccupied with their internal squabbles, proved incapable of mounting a coordinated defense. Local lords began to build their own castles and raise their own armies to defend their lands, their power growing as that of the central monarchy waned. The age of feudalism was dawning, and with it, the political fragmentation of Europe. The Saxon Revival, 919 to 962 AD. For nearly a century after the death of Charles the Fat in 888, the last Carolingian to briefly reunite the empire, the title of emperor was contested, irrelevant, or simply unused. It was a period often described as the Dark Age of the Iron Century, where power devolved to local dukes and counts, and the kingdoms of East and West Francia developed along separate paths. In East Francia, Germany, the Carolingian line died out, and the great tribal dukes, of Saxony, Franconia, Swabia, and Bavaria, elected one of their own as king. The first of these, Ottonian, kings was Henry the Fowler, Duke of Saxony, 919–936. A pragmatic and capable ruler, Henry focused on securing his kingdom's borders, fortifying towns against the Magyar horsemen who were ravaging Europe, and consolidating royal power. But it was his son, Otto I, who would truly revive the imperial idea. Crowned king in Aachen in 936, Otto consciously modeled himself on Charlemagne. He sat on Charlemagne's marble throne, and his coronation was a deliberate evocation of Carolingian tradition. He was a man of immense ambition and military genius, determined to be more than just a first among equals in Germany. His first task was to break the power of the rebellious dukes, which he did with brutal efficiency. His authority secured, he turned to the great external threat, the Magyars. In 955, at the Battle of Lechfeld, Otto annihilated the Magyar army, a victory that ended their incursions for good and earned him the title, the Great. He was now the undisputed master of Germany and the champion of Christendom. Like Charlemagne, Otto's power drew him into Italy. The Italian kingdom was in chaos, a prize fought over by local magnates, and the papacy had sunk to a nadir of corruption and violence, becoming a toy for powerful Roman families. When Pope John XII, a young man of notorious debauchery, appealed to Otto for protection from his Italian enemies, the stage was set. Otto crossed the Alps, pacified Italy, and entered Rome. On February 2, 962, in a ceremony that deliberately mirrored the events of 800, Pope John XII crowned Otto I as Holy Roman Emperor. This act is often considered the true foundation of the Holy Roman Empire as a durable political institution. But Otto had learned from history. He immediately forced the Pope and the Roman nobility to swear an oath to him, and he issued the Privilegium Attonianum, a decree that asserted imperial sovereignty over the papacy and gave the emperor the right to approve papal elections. The balance of power had shifted. This time, the emperor had crowned the Pope, not the other way around. The Ottoman Empire was a different entity from Charlemagne's. Its heartland was Germany, not Francia, and its emperor was a German king first. But Otto had successfully resurrected the idea of a transalpine realm unifying Germany and Italy under a single, Roman-crowned Christian emperor. The Holy Roman Empire was reborn, and it would persist as the central political structure in the heart of Europe for the next 8 centuries. The Long Shadow. The empire founded by Charlemagne and revived by Otto would follow a long and complex history. It would see the investiture controversy, where Pope and Emperor would clash over the soul of Christendom. It would witness the grandeur of the Hohenstaufen Frederick Barbarossa and the tragic brilliance of Frederick II. It would evolve into the peculiar, decentralized entity described by Voltaire as neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire, a patchwork of hundreds of principalities, bishoprics, and free cities under the nominal rule of the emperor. Yet, through all its transformations, the ghost of Charlemagne lingered. He became the archetype of the Christian emperor, a figure of legend and a model for his successors. His memory was invoked by Napoleon, who consciously emulated his coronation, and by Adolf Hitler, who saw himself as the founder of a new, 1,000-year Reich. The Holy Roman Empire was finally dissolved in 1806, under pressure from Napoleon. But the idea it represented, of a unified Europe, of a central power balancing regional interests, of a cultural and political space transcending narrow nationalism, never entirely died. In the modern European Union, with its capital in the Carolingian heartland of Brussels and Strasbourg, one can detect faint, distant echoes of Charlemagne's dream, a diverse continent, bound together not by the sword, but by shared law, common currency, and a fragile, hopeful aspiration for peace. The story that began with the Iron Crown of the Franks and the Golden Crown in St. Peter's is, therefore, more than a historical narrative. It is the story of an idea, flawed, often violent, and ultimately impossible to sustain, that has shaped, and continues to shape, the very concept of the West. The empire Charlemagne built did not last, but the shadow it cast was 1,000 years long. The Emperor and the Pope, 1075 to 1122 AD. The Ottoman and Salian dynasties that followed Otto I had strengthened the empire, but in doing so, they had created a formidable institution, the Imperial Church. Bishops and abbots, appointed by the emperor, were not just spiritual leaders but also powerful temporal princes, controlling vast swathes of land and providing the crown with its most reliable administrators and soldiers. The emperor, in effect, was the master of the church within his domains. This system, known as lay investiture, saw kings and emperors symbolically bestowing the ring and crozier, the symbols of spiritual office, upon the clerics they chose. This fusion of spiritual and temporal power reached its zenith under the Salian Emperor Henry III, a man of profound piety and immense authority. In 1046, he marched into Rome and deposed 3 rival popes, cleaning out the stables of a corrupt papacy and appointing a series of reform-minded German pontiffs. He acted as the true head of Christendom, but in his zeal to reform, he had unwittingly empowered an ideology that would challenge the very foundations of imperial power. The movement he fostered, the Gregorian Reform, named for its most zealous champion, Pope Gregory VII, sought to liberate the Church from secular control. Its core principle was libertas ecclesiae, the freedom of the Church. For the Reformers, this meant an end to lay investiture. The soul of the Church could not be subject to the whims of worldly kings. Only the clergy could appoint clergy. The spiritual sword must be independent of, and ultimately superior to, the temporal sword. The clash was inevitable, and it came to a head between Henry III's son, the proud and capable Henry IV, and the fiery, uncompromising Pope Gregory VII. In 1075, Gregory formally banned lay investiture in his Dictatus Papae, a document that asserted unprecedented papal powers, including the authority to depose emperors. Henry IV, seeing this as a direct assault on the foundations of his rule, reacted with fury. He summoned a synod of German bishops loyal to him and declared Gregory deposed, addressing him in a letter with the infamous salutation, Hildebrand, Gregory's birth name, now not pope, but false monk, such a greeting. Gregory's response was swift and seismic. He excommunicated Henry IV, releasing all his subjects from their oaths of allegiance. The German princes, always eager to weaken the emperor, seized their chance. They rebelled, telling Henry that unless he received absolution within a year, they would elect a new king. This led to one of the most dramatic scenes of the Middle Ages. In the bitter winter of 1077, the king of the Germans, heir to Charlemagne, traveled as a penitent pilgrim across the Alps to Canossa, the castle in northern Italy where the Pope was staying. For 3 days, Henry stood barefoot in the snow outside the gates, begging for forgiveness. Gregory, trapped by the demands of Christian mercy, finally relented and absolved him. Canossa was a political masterpiece for the Pope and a humiliating defeat for the emperor, but it was not the end of the war. The conflict, known as the investiture controversy, raged for decades, a brutal struggle of propaganda, military campaigns, and rival kings. It demonstrated that the papal cry of freedom of the Church could be a powerful weapon against imperial authority. The conflict was finally resolved in 1122 by the Concordat of Worms, a compromise. The emperor agreed to stop investing bishops with the ring and crozier, symbolically acknowledging the Church's spiritual freedom. In return, the Pope allowed the emperor to be present at episcopal elections and to invest the bishop with the scepter, representing his temporal rights and lands. It was a pragmatic split of the bishop's 2 roles, but the ideological victory belonged to the papacy. The emperor had been forced to acknowledge a limit to his power. The unitary ideal of Charlemagne's Christendom was broken, and the 2 swords, spiritual and temporal, were now in separate hands, destined to clash for centuries to come. The Ghost of Rome, 1155–1250 AD. Though the investiture controversy had checked imperial power, the dream of restoring the Roman Empire in its full glory never died. It found its most passionate exponents in the Hohenstaufen dynasty, and particularly in the figure of Frederick I, nicknamed Barbarossa for his red beard. Frederick, crowned emperor in 1155, consciously evoked the memory of Rome and Charlemagne. He spoke of his authority as an imperium that was both holy and Roman, and he propagated the concept of the translatio imperii, the transfer of empire, from the Greeks, the Byzantines, to the Franks under Charlemagne, and now to the Germans. For him, the empire was the direct and legitimate continuation of ancient Rome. He introduced Roman law into his courts, seeing himself as a new Justinian, and his ambitions knew no bounds. But the world had changed. The cities of northern Italy, enriched by trade, had grown powerful and fiercely independent. They wanted to govern themselves, not answer to a German emperor. The papacy, still riding the high tide of the Gregorian reform, viewed the Hohenstaufen ambition to dominate Italy with terror, fearing the loss of its hard-won liberty. Thus began the epic struggle between the Guelphs, supporters of the Pope, and the Ghibellines, supporters of the emperor. For decades, Barbarossa led his armies across the Alps to subdue the Italian cities. He razed Milan to the ground, but the Lombard League, an alliance of cities backed by the Pope, resisted. At the Battle of Legnano in 1176, the imperial knightly cavalry was defeated by the citizen militias of the Lombard League. It was a symbolic turning point. The communal spirit of the rising cities had proven a match for feudal imperial power. Barbarossa was forced to make peace, granting the cities considerable autonomy. The struggle reached its apocalyptic climax under Barbarossa's grandson, Frederick II. A truly extraordinary figure, Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world, Frederick was a paradox incarnate. King of Germany, King of Sicily, Holy Roman Emperor, he was a German by birth, a Norman by inheritance, and a Sicilian by preference. His court in Palermo was a vibrant center of learning where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars interacted freely. He was a crusader who negotiated the peaceful handover of Jerusalem through diplomacy rather than war, and a skeptic who wrote a learned treatise on falconry. Yet, to the papacy, he was the ultimate enemy. A Hohenstaufen ruling both Germany and the rich, strategically vital kingdom of Sicily was a nightmare, encircling the papal states. Popes excommunicated him repeatedly, calling him the Antichrist. The final struggle was merciless. Frederick fought back with armies and propaganda, but the papal weapon of crusade was now turned against a Christian emperor. The war drained the empire's resources and prestige. When Frederick II died in 1250, the Hohenstaufen line collapsed. The papacy had won, but at a terrible cost. The Great Interregnum that followed, 1250 to 1273, saw no recognized emperor, and central authority in Germany disintegrated. The dream of a unified imperial Italy was dead, and in Germany, power shifted decisively to the regional princes. The empire survived, but as a loose, fragmented confederation, its universal claims a distant memory. The ghost of Rome had been exorcised, not by barbarians, but by popes and city-states. The Emperor's New Clothes, 1356 to 1648 AD. The empire that emerged from the Great Interregnum was a shadow of its former self. The title of Holy Roman Emperor was no longer a position of command but one of negotiation. In 1356, Emperor Charles IV, a pragmatic and shrewd ruler, issued the Golden Bull, the empire's most important constitutional document. It formalized what had become practice. The emperor would be chosen by 7 prince-electors, the archbishops of Mainz, Trier, and Cologne, the king of Bohemia, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, and the Margrave of Brandenburg. The bull made no mention of needing papal confirmation, a final victory for the imperial side on that specific issue. But its effect was to cement the power of the great princes. The empire became an aristocratic republic, a federal entity long before the term was coined. The emperor was its president, but his own power base was his hereditary lands, in the case of the Habsburg dynasty that came to dominate the title after 1438, this meant Austria. This decentralized structure was both the empire's weakness and its strength. It was weak in that it could rarely act with the speed and force of a centralized monarchy like France. Yet, it was resilient. Its complex system of courts, the Reichskammergericht, and diets, the Reichstag, provided a framework for resolving disputes and managing collective affairs, fostering a unique German legal and political culture. The Reformation of the 16th century shattered this delicate balance. Martin Luther's challenge to church authority in 1517 created a permanent religious schism within the empire. The Lutheran and later Calvinist princes fought for their right to determine the religion of their territories, cuius regio, ius religio, whose realm, his religion. The Emperor Charles V, a man who ruled a global empire, on which the sun never set, spent his life trying to crush the Protestants and restore Catholic unity within the Holy Roman Empire. He failed. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 established a temporary, uneasy truce, but the religious tensions simmered, eventually exploding into the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648. This was the empire's final and most destructive civil war, a horrific conflict of religion, dynasty, and geopolitics that drew in all the major European powers. It devastated the German lands, killing perhaps a third of the population. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 that ended the war was the final nail in the coffin of the old imperial idea. It permanently legitimized Calvinism and strengthened the rights of the individual princes, who were now granted near-sovereign authority to conduct their own foreign policies. The Holy Roman Emperor became a figurehead, a prestigious title held by the Habsburgs of Austria, but his authority over the patchwork of hundreds of German states was negligible. The empire persisted, but as a legal shell, a ghost of a ghost. Epilogue, the final sunset, 1806 AD. For another century and a half, the Holy Roman Empire endured, a relic of a bygone age. It was memorably, if unfairly, described by the French philosopher Voltaire as neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. It was, by the 18th century, an anachronism in a world of rising nation-states like France, Britain, and Prussia. Its end came not with a bang, but with a diplomatic note. The catalyst was Napoleon Bonaparte. His revolutionary armies smashed the old order in Germany. After defeating Austria in 1805, he forced the Emperor Francis II to agree to the Confederation of the Rhine, a league of German states under French protection that seceded from the empire. With the empire stripped of its core territories and its structure shattered, the title was meaningless. On August 6, 1806, Francis II formally declared the Holy Roman Empire dissolved, laying down the imperial crown to prevent Napoleon from seizing it for himself. He retained his title as Francis I, Emperor of Austria, a pragmatic retreat from a universal dream to a national reality. The empire that Charlemagne had built and Otto had revived was gone. It had lasted for 1,000 years, a continuous thread from the Coronation in St. Peter's to the dawn of the modern age. It had failed in its grand ambition to unite Christendom, but it had succeeded in shaping the soul of Europe. It preserved the memory of Rome, fostered the fusion of Germanic and Latin culture, and provided the incubator for the distinct German and French nations. Its long, complex, and often turbulent history is a testament to the enduring power of an idea, the dream of universal order, of peace brought by law, and of a world made whole under a single, sacred authority. That dream died in 1806, but its echo, for better or worse, would reverberate through the centuries that followed, a lasting monument to the legacy of the Frankish king who would be emperor. The dual legacy, 1806-present. The dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire in 1806 was not an endpoint, but a transformation. Its 1,000-year history left a dual and contradictory legacy that would profoundly shape the next 2 centuries of European history. On one hand, it bequeathed a deep-seated ideal of unity, on the other, it entrenched a reality of fragmentation. The German question. The most immediate consequence was the creation of the German question. For centuries, the empire had provided a political framework for the German-speaking peoples of Central Europe. With that framework gone, what was to become of them? The continent was now bookended by 2 centralized nation-states, France and a resurgent Russia, while the German heartland was a disorganized collection of medium and small states, dominated by the 2 rival German powers of Austria and Prussia. The 19th century became a contest to answer this question. Would a new Germany be a Großdeutschland, Greater Germany, including the multi-ethnic Austrian Empire, harkening back to the old imperial tradition? Or would it be a Kleindeutschland, Lesser Germany, led by the more homogeneously German Kingdom of Prussia, which had no sentimental attachment to the old Roman ideal? This struggle was not merely political, it was a battle over the very identity of the German nation. Was its destiny to be a universal, cosmopolitan entity like the old empire, or a modern, efficient, and powerful nation-state? The answer came from the cannons of Prussia. Through a series of calculated wars, against Denmark, 1864, Austria, 1866, and France, 1870–71, the Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck engineered the unification of Germany under Prussian leadership, excluding Austria. The new German Empire, proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles in 1871, was a conscious evocation of the past. Kaiser Wilhelm I was deliberately echoing the titles of Charlemagne and the medieval emperors. Yet, this new Reich was the antithesis of the old. It was a centralized, bureaucratic, and fiercely nationalistic state, built for power and efficiency, not for universal Christian salvation. The Holy Roman Empire's ghost was invoked, but its spirit had been exorcised. The Austrian heir. The other heir to the old empire was Austria. The Habsburgs, having laid down the imperial crown of the Romans, fell back on their title as emperors of Austria. Their realm was a direct descendant of the old, multi-ethnic, composite structure of the Holy Roman Empire. It was a Europe in miniature, a dynastic state holding together Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ruthenians, Italians, and South Slavs. It struggled with the same centrifugal forces that had plagued the Holy Roman Empire, the rising tide of nationalism. The Austrian Empire, and later the Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy, was the last great embodiment of the pre-national, supranational ideal that Charlemagne had represented. Its collapse at the end of World War I in 1918 marked the final, definitive end of that political model in Central Europe. The shadow of the past. The legacy of the Holy Roman Empire also cast a long and darker shadow. The medieval concept of the translatio imperii, the transfer of imperial authority, was twisted into a dangerous ideology. The idea that a single power had a God-given right to hegemony over Central Europe became a potent force in German nationalism. Both the Second Reich, 1871–1918, and the Third Reich, 1933–1945, exploited this historical narrative. Adolf Hitler, in particular, explicitly referenced the First Reich, the Holy Roman Empire, as a precursor to his own vision of a thousand-year Germanic Empire. He saw himself as completing the work of Charlemagne and Barbarossa, forging a unified, racially pure realm destined to dominate the continent. This grotesque perversion of the imperial idea led to the ultimate negation of its original, albeit flawed, Christian universalism. The European Phoenix. Yet, from the ashes of World War II, a new and more hopeful echo of the old empire began to stir. The catastrophic failure of the nation-state model through 2 world wars led visionaries like Robert Schuman, Konrad Adenauer, and Alcide de Gasperi to seek a different path. They looked back beyond the era of nationalist rivalries to a time when Western Europe, for all its conflicts, had shared a common cultural and legal space. The European project that began with the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951 and evolved into the European Union was, in many ways, a secular and democratic reimagining of the Carolingian ideal. It sought to create a supranational entity that respected regional diversity while fostering peace, unity, and shared prosperity through law and collective institutions. Its core area, encompassing France, Germany, Benelux, and Italy, maps almost perfectly onto the heartlands of Charlemagne's empire. Its capital, Brussels, sits near the old Carolingian heartland of Aachen. The EU, with its complex system of directives, its European Court of Justice, and its multilingual parliament, is a modern, peaceful analogue to the old imperial diets and courts, attempting to balance the power of its member states with the needs of the whole. The enduring echo. The story that began on a cold Christmas day in 800 did not end on a summer day in 1806. The Holy Roman Empire was more than a state, it was an enduring idea that has proven remarkably resilient. It was the first sustained attempt to build a unified political order in post-Roman Western Europe, and its successes and failures have shaped the continent's DNA. Its primary legacy is the concept of unity in diversity. The empire never achieved the centralized homogeneity of Rome or the modern nation-state. Instead, it was a messy, often dysfunctional, but remarkably durable federation of distinct peoples, laws, and traditions under a single, overarching authority. This model of layered sovereignty, of complex legal arrangements balancing local rights with central power, is a pre-echo of the modern federal state and the European Union. The empire also bequeathed to the West the enduring tension between spiritual and temporal power. The epic struggle between pope and emperor, between sacerdotium and imperium, defined the Middle Ages and forced a separation of powers that would later contribute to the development of Western secularism. It established that no single authority, not even an emperor, could claim absolute power over both the body and the soul. Finally, the memory of Charlemagne's empire left a cultural and historical template, a story that Europeans tell themselves about their past. It is a story of a golden age of unity, followed by fragmentation and strife, and a perpetual longing for reintegration. This narrative has been used to justify conquest and inspire cooperation. It has fueled nightmares of hegemony and dreams of perpetual peace. The crown may have been melted down, the titles forgotten, and the borders erased, but the idea that was born in the mind of a Frankish king and sanctified in a Roman basilica has never truly died. It sleeps in the stones of Aachen, whispers in the halls of Brussels, and endures in the perpetual, restless, and hopeful effort to build a united Europe. The Holy Roman Empire is gone, but its echo is forever part of the rhythm of the Western heart. The dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire in 1806 did not erase its millennium of history. Instead, its legacy fragmented, seeding ideas and conflicts that would define the next 2 centuries. The empire's dual nature, a universal ideal paired with a reality of fractured sovereignty, created a German question that became the central problem of European geopolitics. The German crucible. With the ancient imperial framework gone, the German-speaking world was adrift. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 created a feeble substitute, the German Confederation, a loose association of 39 states, a pale shadow of the old empire. This power vacuum ignited a fierce debate over national identity. 2 competing visions emerged, the Großdeutschland, Greater Germany, solution, which would include the multi-ethnic Austrian Empire, echoing the old universalist ideal, and the Kleindeutschland, Lesser Germany, solution, led by the efficient, militaristic Kingdom of Prussia, which had no sentimental attachment to the Roman past. The answer was delivered not by diplomacy, but by blood and iron. Under Otto von Bismarck, Prussia engineered a series of swift wars, culminating in the defeat of France in 1871. The new German Empire, proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, was a deliberate, if cynical, evocation of the past. Kaiser Wilhelm I was styled as an heir to Charlemagne, yet this new Reich was the antithesis of the old. It was a centralized, bureaucratic nation-state, built for power and conquest, not for upholding a Christian commonwealth. The Holy Roman Empire's ghost was invoked to legitimize a power that would ultimately destroy the European balance it had once represented. The Habsburg anachronism. The other heir, Austria, became a living anachronism. The Habsburgs, now emperors of Austria, presided over a realm that was the true successor to the old empire's multi-ethnic, composite structure. It was a dynastic empire, holding together a dozen nationalities through a complex bureaucracy and the personal loyalty to the crown. It was the last bastion of the pre-national, supranational ideal, and it struggled desperately against the rising tide of nationalism that its own former existence had helped to incubate. Its collapse in 1918 at the end of World War I was the final, definitive end of the political model Charlemagne had inaugurated. The twisted inheritance. The legacy of the empire also cast a long, dark shadow. The medieval concept of the translatio imperii, the transfer of imperial authority to the Germans, was warped into a dangerous ideology of entitlement. The notion of a German-led Middle Europa, Central Europe, became a powerful and destructive force. This trajectory reached its horrific apex in the Third Reich. Adolf Hitler explicitly referenced the First Reich, the Holy Roman Empire, as a precursor to his own. He saw himself as completing the work of Charlemagne and Barbarossa, forging a unified, racially pure realm destined for continental domination. This perversion of the imperial idea led to the ultimate negation of its original, albeit flawed, universalism, culminating in a war of annihilation that nearly destroyed European civilization. The Carolingian Phoenix. Yet, from the absolute ruin of World War II, a new and more hopeful echo of the old empire began to stir. The catastrophic failure of the hypernationalist model led visionaries like Robert Schuman, Konrad Adenauer, and Alcide de Gasperi to seek a different path. They looked back, beyond the rivalries of nation-states, to a time when Western Europe had shared a common cultural and legal space. The European project that began with the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951 was, in essence, a secular and democratic reimagining of the Carolingian ideal. Its founding purpose, to make war not merely unthinkable, but materially impossible, was the ultimate repudiation of the nationalistic forces the old empire had failed to contain. Its core area, encompassing France, Germany, Benelux, and Italy, maps almost perfectly onto the heartlands of Charlemagne's empire. Its capital, Brussels, sits near the old Carolingian heartland of Aachen. The EU, with its complex system of regulations, its European Court of Justice, and its multilingual parliament, is a modern, peaceful analogue to the old imperial diets and courts, attempting to balance the power of its member states with the needs of the whole. The unbroken thread. The story that began on a cold Christmas day in 800 did not end on a summer day in 1806. The Holy Roman Empire was more than a state, it was a persistent and adaptable idea. Its primary legacy is the concept of unity in diversity. It never achieved the centralized homogeneity of Rome or the modern nation-state. Instead, it was a messy, often dysfunctional, but remarkably durable federation of distinct peoples, laws, and traditions under a single, overarching authority. This model of layered sovereignty is a pre-echo of both the modern federal state and the European Union. The empire also bequeathed to the West the enduring tension between spiritual and temporal power. The epic struggle between Pope and Emperor forced a separation of powers that would later contribute to the development of Western secularism, establishing that no single authority could claim absolute power over both body and soul. Finally, the memory of Charlemagne's empire left a cultural and historical template, a story that Europeans tell themselves about their past. It is a story of a golden age of unity, followed by fragmentation and strife, and a perpetual longing for reintegration. This narrative has been used to justify conquest and inspire cooperation, it has fueled nightmares of hegemony and dreams of perpetual peace. The crown has been melted down, the titles forgotten, and the borders erased, but the idea born in the mind of a Frankish king and sanctified in a Roman basilica has never truly died. It sleeps in the stones of Aachen, whispers in the halls of Brussels, and endures in the perpetual, restless, and hopeful effort to build a united Europe. The Holy Roman Empire is gone, but its echo, a complex harmony of memory, tragedy, and aspiration, is forever part of the rhythm of the Western heart. Help me reach 7,000 subscribers. Please like the video and share your thoughts in the comments.